Hi everyone. In this lesson we'll be taking the layouts within websites a step further, and we'll be looking at a thing called CSS grids. So CSS grids are ex- so basically a grid of elements. So the image we've got there up on the page gives you a good idea of basically what a grid is. It's essentially a table. And the CSS grids have a few advantages over the standard nested layout that we just did. So this grid is often used for responsive layouts because it has a few advantages. And the biggest advantage is that it makes aligning basically containers of information much easier, because what happens is if, let's say, this column here where my mouse is gets too much information and then we need more space, the other three or other two containers in this area, or other two elements, also increase in size, keeping them aligned. So it makes alignment a lot easier. So let's have a look at what it all looks like. So I'm going to get a boilerplate layout, and then what I'm going to do, oops, and I've just made an error, hang on one second, is I am going to create a grid to start off with. So what we're going to do is that we're going to create a div in much the same way as we did in the previous lesson. And we might give that the class of the name grid, because that's what we're creating. Okay. And then we need to do some styling to set the grid actually all up. So the first thing that we want to do there is, let's create ourselves a style tab. And what we want to do is we're going to use a different display setting. So display setting is grid. Oops. Oh, I haven't actually targeted what I'm actually trying to style, which is always helpful. Display. And we're setting it as grid. And we're going to, okay. So the first thing you're telling it when you're setting this is basically you want it to be a grid. Now the second thing that we need to set is, if we have a grid, obviously we're having more than one container, because that's why you would use a grid, otherwise you wouldn't use one. So we need to tell it how wide the containers are, or you can actually set them for how tall, but most people normally set them by columns. Okay, and the way that we can do that is we can say, let's say the first column, for example, might be 100 pixels, the second one might be 200 pixels, and the third one might be 300 pixels. And once you have that, then essentially you've got a grid and you're telling it what the size of the columns are. Now, the next thing we want to be able to do is that for each one of these columns that we've created, in this case we've created 3, we need a div element, so to actually house that container, if that makes sense. So we might just give column 1, and then we might have div 2, which might be column 2, and then we've got div 3, which is going to be column 3. Okay, so once we have that, and to make it easier to see kind of what's going on and exactly the spaces in which all these things, what we're going to do is I'm just going to style the background color. And I'm just going to do it, normally I would do it in the styling, but it's easier to see what's going on if the styling is close by. So we're just going to create a background color for each one of these, and I might go aqua for one, and I might do the same for copy, paste, and then I might do a different color in the middle, and we might just pick a different color there, and we might do sorry, light, let's say we do light pink. Okay. Okay, so now we can save that and we can have a bit of a look at what we'll close this. Okay, and so basically what we've created is our 3 elements. Now, if we wanted to, that's our first row. Now, if we want to create additional cells within this grid or additional elements, what we can do is that we can add additional div tags. And so for additional div tags, if I then make that element column 4 or element 4, just to make it a little bit different, if I save that, you'll see that it adds onto the bottom. Okay, and if I continue this process and I take another 2 elements, for example, copy and we'll paste that down there, and we'll make that column 5 and column 6, and we save that there, what we can see is that you can see clearly that if I keep adding divs, it's just going to wrap around next one after next one. So that's kind of the advantage with a very nicely structured looking table. Now what we might also do to make it look a little bit neater, not that we're trying to be making it look terribly fantastic, just want to show you the concepts, is we might set the row gaps so that, and we might row gaps, try again, row gap to, let's say 6 pixels, something small, and we might have the column gap to 6 pixels. So you can see it's pretty easy to arrange. So now we've got a nicely looking graphic. So you can see how this would easily form a table. Now, the things we did with nested tables in the last lesson kind of can be used in conjunction with these grids, because we can then say, well, if we wanted this particular element to have a certain layout with a picture at the top and some text at the bottom, and in different columns and different configurations, we can basically put that inside each nested element and pretty much produce whatever we like. So in the case of YouTube, they would have a series of columns that were exactly the same size to be able to do that. So that makes, so the biggest advantage of these things is the alignment. It makes it very easy. Now, if, for example, and I did mention this at the start, if, for example, let's say one of the elements has additional information into it. So let's say now we're going to put in a P tag with our column 1, and then we're going to add a second P column. So we're adding additional content to each one of this particular cell. So just test, for example, or text. You'll see that what happens is the size of the columns within there remains the same. So that means that that's what we mean by keeping the alignment is much easier than having individual nested boxes. So as I said, you can use these in combination to produce those layouts. Now, a few other things we want to show you at this point is, let's say, for example, we're going to show you another command called 1FR. So what 1FR does is that it will take up the remaining space on the screen. So you'll see we have 100 pixels, 200 pixels, and then that third column is just going to take up that remaining space. Whoops, and I've forgotten to save it. So save it so we get the update. And once we get our update, you can see it's taking up the remaining of the screen. Now, if we do, and we will be talking a little bit more about this for the first time, if we're talking about responsive layouts, so what a responsive layout is, this is what we see on my particular screen, because my screen is a certain width. Now, if you open the website, which a lot of people do on different devices, we need the layouts to be able to still look all right with a much smaller screen. So, for example, if I'm hopping on an iPhone, so by the way, how you get this is if you click the button here, that's going to give you the responsive label, and then you can pick out the particular device you're interested in. And so you can see that we get an idea of what the screen's going to look like. So you can see that we have 100 pixels, 200 pixels, and whatever's left over in column 3. So that is kind of what a responsive layout is. And this also gives you, if there's not one of the devices, we can see what's going to happen to the layout when we open and close the thing. So that's basically what a responsive layout is. So if we wanted to play around a little bit more with this F1FR command, let's say instead I also want to make this one fill up the remaining space, and we'll adjust it. What it does is both of these columns will take half each of the space that's left over. So we do our responsive layout, they're the same size, but they're changing consistently to the same size depending upon how wide the screen is. Okay, so that's one of the biggest advantage of this, and this is you're beginning to head down the path of responsive layout, which is, if you're a professional programmer, this is something that you need to take into account because we want your site to look good on all sorts of applications. Now, with this 1FR, the way that this works is that this is actually a ratio. So, for example, if I change this number here to 2, and we go and look at what it does to the layout, what you'll see now is that the second column is taking up twice the amount of space that the third column is. Okay, and again, if we do our responsive layout and go in and out, it's always the case. This column 2 is getting twice the space that this column 3 is. Okay, and the way that this is actually working is that it works as a ratio. So the FR just means basically it takes up whatever space is left over, and the number in front tells you the ratio of the amount. So, for example, in the example we've got here, there is 3 FRs in there. There is 2 and a 1, which gives you 3. So basically, how the computer interprets this is it says, well, 2 FR, when there's a 1 FR here means that there is 3 FRs effectively. 2 out of the 3, or 2/3 of the space that's available, should be devoted to that middle column, and 1/3 to the remaining column. So if we take that to extremes and we say, right, instead of it being 2, let's make it 4, that means that the total FR value is 5, of which 4 out of the 5 should be devoted to the central column. And if we go and check what's happening, basically we can basically see this happening. And again, with the responsive layout again, we can see that it's taking 80% of the available space while this one remains fixed. So that is kind of means that your screen is always full, which is good. Okay, now another issue with responsive layout is sometimes we'll have a situation where we have basically the space on the responsive layout gets too small, so the screen gets too narrow, and so we can't fit in the content that we require. So to be able to deal with that, we can use another property of the grid here, which I can never remember. Honestly, never remember the code, and the code is just in the website, so you can just jump in and copy it in. We'll show you what it does. Okay, so if we do that, okay, and so we're now setting it using a different parameter. Okay, so what we're doing with this different parameter is that we're making everything 300 pixels wide, and we're doing what's called an autofill. Now, we'll just show you what the effect is. You don't need to worry too much about understanding exactly how the code is constructed in this particular one, but we'll show you what the effect is. So every column is now 300 wide. Okay, so we're now, every time something's appear, it's 300 wide. Now, if we have a look at what happens with a responsive layout, okay, and we have a look here, we're starting, and we can see now that now we've gone down to a smaller phone. These are 300 wide, so you can see that they can fill the entire space equal amounts up to 300. But then when it gets to under 600, it jumps to 1. So that's what's called a responsive layout. So basically what we're doing is essentially saying that these columns can be no smaller than 300 pixels wide. And as we drag them out, more and more columns appear. Okay, so that means that if we have an element that can't fit in less than 300, then our website's still going to look pretty reasonable. So let me give you an example of one that's being built here, which we'll do now. I think it's here. Okay, and I'm going to play this with a live server. Okay, and what you can see with this one, if we do our responsive layout, okay, and so what's happening here is that basically we've got some information here and some information here, and when we bring it around, what happens is that the content moves to align so that the website still looks pretty reasonable. Okay, so that's quite an important sort of example of how you can start to make your website responsive. So you can see that if you use this setting with the pixels at a certain width, then you can basically get it to wrap around, and so you can put your elements in there and just make your site look good no matter what the size of the screen is. Alrighty guys, give the exercises at the end of this lesson a crack, and we'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.